recording, and I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay. And then we can have, I think we might not need the transcription actually. And then we can have, oh, I see, there you go. Have Kai and Eva joining. Hi, Eva. Hi, Kai. Perfect timing. We're just starting the presentation. So good that you can join us. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we have first Oliver Segot presenting on UNEP's Sustainable Blue Economy Transition Framework. Oliver, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dennis, and hello all. It's nice to meet you. Oliver Segot, UNEP Marine Brands. I'm based in our main office in Nairobi, and I coordinate our sort of UNEP-wide work on developing a sustainable blue economy approach. Working closely with our colleagues in the green economy team in Geneva and Paris, and UNEP FI. This work has been going on for, what is it, 1.5 years, good 2 years, and linking different kind of areas, expertise, and issues across the UNEP portfolio into a more consolidated and collaborative approach that we can offer to countries and regional seas and so forth. So I'll give you, I try to run through this relatively quick so we have some time, but I'll go and give you a little bit in introduction to the sort of conceptual approach we're taking. This idea of what we believe is a sustainable blue economy approach, and how countries can actually make that, practical and achievable. And with that comes this whole issue of building a strong governance and enabling environment to deliver a blue economy approach in the national context. So after this, we'll jump to hear about our blue economy model framework and the architecture for budgeting. And there is one more piece that we're not having today on blue economy modeling framework, but our key colleague there, was Andrea Bassi, was not available, but we will fill in and potentially introduce in a subsequent discussion. So next slide, please. So from a UNEP perspective, what is a sustainable blue economy? And what are the key assets or values that we can see from our perspective on our ocean work? For us, at the heart of the sustainable blue economy is 100% well-managed, healthy ocean. And it's not only, let's say, our perspective, it's indeed a focus that we see getting a lot of momentum among countries, the high-level ocean panel, a number of regional seas partners, a number of countries are all talking about how a healthy ocean is a foundational piece to a sustainable blue economy. And within that broader perspective, a top priority is to enable and protect less tangible blue assets. And I'm talking about features like sustainable lifestyle and livelihoods, how we can support, or blue economy can support sound food systems, how natural infrastructure can be supported to be representing and enabling nature-based solutions, how a blue economy can support climate mitigation and adaptation, including blue carbon sequestration. And within it also, of course, the look at sector approaches and how we can make sustainable ocean sectors most responsible: tourism, fisheries, energy, and so forth. But the whole approach from UNEP perspective is this more joined up synergistic approach. Next slide, please. A key outcome of a blue economy that's sustainable is increased revenue. Okay, I'm happy to take questions. I see a hand from Jesus, from Frank.
No, just on the previous slide, I was wondering if you had a definition of the blue economy which is similar to the one that for instance, the EU Commission uses, or if you included in it also the management of detrimental activities that are land-based and that affects the ocean.
Yeah,
it is of importance in the end because So I
fully agree, Frank. Actually, we don't have a firm definition like many others. We are, of course, relying on the World Bank's definition to some extent. We are looking at the EU, the Green Deal definition. Various players have different definitions, and yet we know there's no universally adopted definition, and many countries are also not very clear what it should be. So I think we see a need, and we hope that in the future there will be some sort of common definition, like we have just seen the adoption of the UNEP resolution on nature-based solution. But I think at this point it doesn't exist, and so what we're offering is, in a way, a package and a sort of approach that can help the countries internalize blue economy in their own setting and in essence do their own definition. But we do acknowledge there's this gap and to some extent some confusion. The important point of land-based activities is at the center of our approach, and I will get to that in a second. But we very much, and also maybe to that is a typical question, we very much build on our blue economy, on our green economy work and philosophy. So low carbon, green sector approaches, linking land and sea. We can build on, and UNEP has a competitive advantage on blue economy by looking at the 10 years of green economy work, and yet we recognize that there's some differences. There's a very complex situation at the coast, many drivers, and therefore we do emphasize that there's actually a sustainable blue economy approach, but it has linked to land, and we sometimes call it the green blue economy approach. But let me just continue a little bit, and then I'll give you the framework, and then we have further conversation. But I think it is a conversation. This is not a lecture. But just into where we see it is that the key outcome from blue economy is that increases revenue, enables sustainable growth in the marine economy through enhanced services provided by the health environment, strengthen and that including tackling land-based activities. It offers strengthened livelihood and food security, and ensure fair and equitable access to the ocean wealth across different sectors, local communities, and at society level. And it should contribute to climate change mitigation, supporting renewable energy options, decarbonization, and nature-based climate solution. In UNEP speak, we talk about our medium-term strategy. We acknowledge we are facing a triple planetary crisis of climate change, nature loss, and pollution. So this blue economy approach somehow connect those three in a connected approach, and they certainly support development goals 14 and a whole range of other ocean-related SDGs. It's really offering a synergistic approach to deliver sustainability. Next slide, please. So what we are proposing is a framework that helps countries think through what a transition to a sustainable, resilient, inclusive blue economy looks like. And this is sort of communicating this concept to sort of a broader set of stakeholders, is moving from this situation with very degraded ocean and coastal areas impacted by land-based pollution, coastal development, to a much more pristine or healthy environment. And so essentially we are assisting countries to think through what a transition pathway can look like, or we can call it an impact pathway to blue economy, and helping countries to define what is the vision for sustainable blue economy in their national context. What key challenges are there that need to be resolved for that transition to happen? Who need to be involved in the transition? What are the key entry points to develop a blue economy? And what are the key steps needed to address the problem identified? So basically a step zero before you really get started on your blue economy policy and implementation framework. Next slide, please. We think there are 5 core elements that can make a sustainable blue economy realistic and practical. It's about protecting, restoring, and regenerating healthy marine and coastal ecosystems. It delivers equitable processes and outcomes. It enables climate stability and resilience. It delivers sustainable consumption and production, and within that, it applies circular economy approaches. Next slide, please. By adopting these 5 principles, there are a number of benefits that you could generate from a sustainable blue economy, And we will share this presentation, so I will not go into all the details, but it ranges from increased extent of effective management ecosystems and restoration, to increased representation of women and youth and marginalized groups in blue economy, to blue economy activities and infrastructures that are low carbon and or even have negative carbon, generate nature-based solutions for mitigating and adapting to climate change and so forth. So all these benefits are kind of a menu that a country can consider and align different policy areas. And by joining up those 5 areas, they can generate those benefits across the different sectors. Next slide, please. So the key question, how do you make that transition practical? And UNEP is supporting policymakers to navigate this ambitious journey with evidence-based tools and policy areas through the Sustainable Economy Transition Framework. And the framework provides a structure for integrating ocean and coastal policy, management, and governance in practice. And it provides practical and pragmatic approaches for governments. It provides assistance in identifying different pathways towards blue economy. One of the key tools is the rapid readiness assessment approach to map assets and opportunities and gaps. And it builds a guide to enabling environment for investment. Next slide, please. And the framework aims to help the countries and the relevant stakeholders, so communities, industry, investors, to identify and develop tangible actions and opportunities to blue economy. And this has been designed to complement and contribute to many existing blue economy initiatives and programs at both national, regional, and global level. So it's a key point here that, of course, we are building, the country should be building on past decades of ocean management, policy development. They are not redundant. We are actually reinforcing them, but provide the, I would say, blue economy lens into existing policy work. Next slide, please. So the framework is really designed to make the decision practical and achievable and customized to a country's unique setting and needs by breaking it down in really tangible steps and key tools. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, 3 main phases, considering the 5 principles and how you build them into a visioning process and developing of a strong integrated policy frame for blue economy. And the first step is really about understanding the system, identify interpoint for blue economy transition, understanding the system links and dynamics, gaps, and opportunities. I will revisit that in a moment. The main piece of the framework is really about generating strategic policy development, connecting a blue economy vision with an integrated policy framework and guided by a strong policy coherence approach in practice. And the third phase is about implementation. Now we really get into implementing the policy, and that's where you use existing processes like marine spatial planning, coastal zone management, build related enabling environment, but again, really building a much stronger focus on the economics into those existing frameworks. Next slide, please. Again, we will share this, and we have also a further documentation, but in a nutshell, the first activity is about understanding how the present system looks like, the policy and the institutional arrangement, existing arrangements and any gaps there might be, setting up economic baselines, social baseline, environmental baseline, and stakeholder arrangements. And that feeds into a good understanding of the system links, and it develops what we call as a dynamics map of how the current governance system looks like and where the gaps are. And this is where you bring in different sectors, ocean sectors. You will certainly often ask the Minister of Planning or Finance to take a leading role in developing this analysis. Next slide, please. So based on that understanding and understanding the 5 principles for a blue economy and the due attention to own development needs and interest in the country, you can then help define a blue economy vision And you can set, you can develop a long-term vision with targets, indicators, and operational objectives. You can support how a cross-sector policy setup can implement that vision. You can look at green sector opportunities and support that. And you do the public expenditure reviews, planning, and sustainable finance. And what it generates is a sustainable blue economy integrated policy framework. And that's the main outcome of a, let's say, 18 to 24 months process. Next slide, please. And that goes into implementation. We call it delivering change. You use that integrated policy framework and implement it through integrated marine management, like spatial planning, coastal management, land sea planning. You develop the related knowledge systems, and data and knowledge sharing systems, build capacity, and you set in place M&E frameworks to measure the progress against those 5 policy areas or main policy targets. Next slide, please. Through the transition process, we recognize that there are an important need for developing cross-cutting enabling actions or enabling environments, including policy support, leadership at the different levels of government, across government, and with key stakeholders. The essential role of sustainable finance through the process, and even the more almost philosophical approach about developing this notion of change across the different constituents, across the different stakeholders, the benefits of setting in motion a transition process and a much more sustainable blue economy can be supported. And the last 2 important ones, use of sound science across the different policy areas, economics, social science, and so forth, and building a strong governance framework. Next slide, please. Very quickly, just as an example, there's a lot of discussion on how nature-based solution forms an important pillar of a blue economy. And just to remind us, we see that as a key part of the approach, and also it's very key focus of the financing work. We know that mangroves, what we call blue forest, often is degraded by development and pollution. But when their value is recognized and incorporated into policy and management, it can lead to a long-term healthy, sustainable ecosystems and communities, deriving a whole range of benefits. In addition to carbon sequestration, also protection from erosion, storm surge and flooding, water filtration, so forth and so forth. So just to give you an example, we see this kind of specific solution as a key part of our framework. And last slide, to remind us that, and coming back to the land-based role and impact of land-based activities, what we promote and argue is really that we need a really joined up approach with focus on connectivity and synergies across policy areas and actors, and recognizing the society dependence on ecosystem health and the complex interactions between different economic and social activities and the ocean is key to drive and enable a sustainable economy. So thank you for that. I'll leave it with that for now. It is a little bit conceptual. There's a bigger document that goes through some of the different elements. Before handing over to a deeper dive into the Blue Economic Finance Framework, I'll pause here for any clarification or points, and then we'll continue. Frank?
Thank you for the presentation, Oli. It seems that you've put a lot of efforts developing a very logical, structured, and ambitious framework. The question I was asking myself looking at this is, there's a number of organizations, countries that have tried to push for politicians or governments to develop better sustainable blue economy strategies. Now, have you looked at what has been tried? What are the successes stories, the failures, and therefore, can you if you go, for instance, I don't know, let's say Norway, who's a big proponent of sustainable blue economy, can you go to them and said, we've looked at what has been done, and based on the failures and successes, that's what we learned. Because from the outsider, what you propose looks very ambitious. Like, wow, I mean, we need to do all that work, have all that data, etc., etc. If me as the, let's say, Kenyan government, I want to do a sustainable blue economy, on what basis will I invest all that efforts doing this if I don't know if it's going to lead to success? So have you done that research and demonstrated that what you do really goes over what has worked and solves the issues that people faced and led to failure in the past?
Thanks for that, Frank. I think I see one more hand. Let me just give everyone briefly. I think it's a very relevant question. The way we approach this is we have been looking at a number of, I mean, to many extent, there is not many integrated blue economy policies that are implemented per se. Often there's a whole prevalence of marine spatial planning, coastal management with various successes and failures. What we see often is that marine spatial planning has a right theoretical ambition, and often what we can see is that the core piece of a strong integrated policy framework is not really built into a marine spatial planning process. So in essence, you often end up in a way you're kind of pushing this cross-sector gap or conflicts of resource and interest unresolved. You push it into a marine spatial plan that is not really resolving the issue. So our approach has been to identify that gap and help. Then how does country develop these integrated policy frameworks, considering the economic, the social, environmental aspects in a more specific and practical way, and set these objectives for the different 5 principles I mentioned. That should lead to a better basis for marine spatial planning process. To the specific question, we have not done a comprehensive review of existing blue economy policies and where they fail, because I think we still can see, and countries are still coming to us to almost still in this sort of step 0. How do we actually get started? We see some countries now coming and saying, we want to develop a blueprint or a marine strategy on for blue economy. And we had that, for instance, that request from Indonesia. They have asked us to come in and help analyze what a transition could look like. And we are also piloting this approach now primarily in Vietnam. They have also come to us and said, how can we navigate that? We want to do fisheries, we want to do tourism, and we want energy, but how does that fit with the blue economy approach? So we primarily looked at where we often see marine spatial planning not being effective. Whether it's a blue economy assessment, perhaps not, but it's certainly some of the challenges we can see. Yeah, we have also done quite a lot of work now with the high-level panel. This notion of sustainable ocean plans that is coming out, and UNEP is one of the partners of this Ocean Action 2030 coalition under the panel, and it's the same kind of challenge that is coming up. It's easy to say 100% ocean management, and of course it's very challenging, and it's often seen without a very strong sort of coordinated policy coherence approach. It's likely to be unresolved. But to be honest, I do take your point. It would be very helpful to have more systematic analysis of where might blue economy frameworks run into issues or past attempts running into problems, and use that as a starting point for the diagnostics of a future policy.
Great, thank you. Yeah, one of the side question I had was whether you can start the whole thing without changing the governance, because what happens is that you have multiple sectors, geographies, and each are under the authorities of different ministries, local authorities, sectors, etc. Who's in charge of the blue economy? Nobody.
Nobody.
It doesn't exist in fact. I mean, in a governance sense.
Yeah, no, it's a little bit the challenge that the field has and country has, and I think we are considering this point of a practical policy coherence element is probably overlooked in many countries, and that's where we will offer a more specific practical approach. And I also do agree it's a little bit ambitious, this framework, and overwhelming. But also the ambition of a sustainable blue economy is also, and that transition is ambitious. So where do you start? And I think we are actually very much looking at that policy coherence and make as our entry point, and what we see is often missing. But we were happy to continue working, and we're also very happy to have that conversation with institutions like yours and other development banks to really get a good sense of what are their realistic steps that they can take. I see one more hand up.
Yes, hello, Ola. Thank you very much for this presentation. I think I'm going to follow up on some of Frank's comments. So you've already alluded, I actually wanted to ask you about the Ocean Coalition and the general work that is being done in supporting the governments to create the sustainable ocean plans. I mean, I was just wondering how much the outline that you have presented sort of feeds into the actual active development. I have to say, I'm personally taking over from my work, from my colleague Lorenzo, the work under the Ocean Action 2030 on behalf of EBRD. So I'm not really up to date on what's been done there, but I know that sort of there was a first call out to organizations who could in fact financially support such development. But I was just wondering if you see that the sustainable ocean plans are pretty much following what you presented, or is it still a wider, what you're presenting is a bit wider above the plans? And similarly to what Frank said, I think we've already discussed during the first meeting, I think that we find that positive examples are the ones that are always speaking the best. So I would say exactly that maybe even if we don't have a country, I think at the moment in the world that has gone through this process and can say that the national level has a good blue economy policy in place, with proper development plans, etc. But I think we have countries which have been paying historically more attention to blue economy, even if they weren't calling it that. So probably coming up with some good examples where sectoral work was being coordinated at the higher level would be a brilliant idea in terms of us being able, as this group, to speak to our counterparties at the governmental level. So I think anything like that, if we can shape next steps of any of the work that the UNEP is doing, that would be brilliant to have. I'm referring to them as case studies, but it's really, whatever sort of resources that could be out there that we could look at. And obviously, you can never compare one country to another, but to sort of have those examples is always very positive in terms of actual practical conversations. And just my third remark on the marine spatial planning. I mean, at the EU level, there's been a directive quite some time in place that obliged the countries to have these plans. We still see massive delays. And like you said, it's still very much under, usually maritime is actually under the Ministry of Transport or something like this. There isn't much more link to other sectors. So we're pushing this agenda as well whenever we get a chance to speak, to take the more holistic view of the economy, of the blue economy, and to sort of, as Frank said, bringing up to, I personally think Ministry of Environment is much better positioned to understand those holistic views, but it's just my view. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Julia. We might take them in reverse order. We see that the interest across some of the countries and the internal discussion of who leads the transition or policy is varying. We have an unfortunate example in Vietnam from our perspective where actually Prime Minister has delegated to Ministry of Environment and Ocean Resources to lead the national blue economy policy work. So that is interesting, but then we can also see they are actually struggling to get on board some of the other sectors who don't want to give up that mandate or role. So it is a little bit tricky. I think some countries, Mauritius, Seychelles, others, have actually managed to set up blue economy ministries. That is perhaps a way to move that process. But I agree, we'll be happy to engage with this group and others to maybe strategize a bit. And to the next question, I also think some let's say positive examples of how things can go about, how countries go about these challenges. We're very happy to work on a sort of portfolio of learning and lessons. An immediate reality is that when we talk about cross-sector, we don't need to take all sectors at once. So for instance, in Vietnam, we actually say, can we maybe start focusing on just 2 or 3? Look at coastal tourism, small-scale fisheries, and energy, for instance, as three primary sectors that they can think about. Where are the pros and cons of a more coordinated approach? So we might be able to find some of these handles and even go more at a local scale within the country, more localized, provincial level. So we're also very happy to continue that, and we already have some examples working with some of our regional seas partners. To the first point, and maybe just to give just 2 seconds of context. So we had the high-level ocean panel with 16 countries agreeing to a quite ambitious agenda of ocean transformation to sustainability. I think that the one you refer to, also main 5 policy areas that they are proposing to focus this transition. Within that, one of the high-level sort of ambitions that have been set by those countries is to put in place what they call sustainable ocean plans by 2025. So there has been a framework developed for that, a guide that you have and your colleagues have contributed to, and UNEP have contributed to, and it captures some of those elements of ecosystem-based management, systemic approaches, building environment, including financing. So what we think our framework is very aligned, and in fact, it takes that also fairly ambitious agenda into practicality. We think our framework offers a practical skeleton to implement sustainable ocean plans. So we are also looking to countries, to the 16 countries and others who are interested, to have more dialogue. And I think the idea of this coalition is either providing financial support or technical support. From UNEP side, we're really looking at the technical support, capacity building and so forth, but it will be great to coordinate internally and join up and see where are the synergies and maybe a joint approach to and to go to some of those countries. And as I mentioned, Indonesia have just reached out to us to ask for support for the maritime plan they want to develop, and with the Bapanas, which is the Ministry of Sustainable Development. And we can see the link there to the sustainable ocean planning process. So I'm happy to have a follow-up chat and see how we can support that. And I'm also sure even in a few days' time in Lisbon, there will be some more conversations on some of those practical steps and offers we can provide. Thanks for that. If not more, in interest of time, I will pass on to Jerome to talk a little briefly about our blue economic financing framework, which is an element of our transition framework package. Over to you, Jerome.
Thank you, Ole. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jerome Dendura. I'm consulting currently for UNEP on the sustainable blue economy, and I've been focusing on developing the blue public finance framework. So as an intro to this blue public finance framework, we try to take a sustainable approach to budgeting, applying that focusing to blue economy. And we thought about how best to sustain and support the transition framework. And in doing so, we felt that we needed to have obviously a number of analytical dimensions that enables us to cover widely enough or broadly enough the policy planning and development cycle. That includes obviously all of the costing framework and the budgeting framework, all the way down to its execution. But doing so, we also thought, okay, we should use a certain set of tools so that can be adjusted to enable a certain level of progressivity. I think answering some of your questions, we have to be realistic. We cannot start having all of the data from day one and having all of the coverage. So it's important to build progressively on what you can analyze and find for each country. And then it was also important to bring a sector view that is useful to the stakeholders in the country. As Ole mentioned, we can start with 2 or 3 sectors in one country. You could expand further. Some countries may have a lot of activities which are land-based and directly impacting on the blue economy. Others may be directly linked to blue economy itself. So it should be providing a choice of sectors that leads to results which are easily understandable and that supports usefully stakeholders' dialogue and engagement on improving policy and improving policy outcomes. So in a nutshell, we wanted to be practical, not replicating what already exists, so using as much as possible what toolkits exist for PFM and budget analysis. It's got to be agile. I think that idea of progressivity, supporting the transition framework from preparedness to the different phase of the transition framework, so that one can understand what are the current policies doing, how they are funded, how they are being executed, how much do they cost to the budget and to the public purse, and do they lead to SBE or not. And it's got to be replicable because we are dealing with a long-term path with different phases. So it needs to be replicable so that one can progress, but also compare over time the change, especially in terms of how much is being funded, how much is being executed, how much does it relate to the economic sectors of interest in that country. So with this in mind, we created a simple version of the Blue Public Finance Framework. Next slide, please, Dennis.
We'll do in a second. You just clarify what PFM stands for. Frank just said that in the chat.
Sorry, Public Finance Management.
There you go. Okay.
Two verse in our stuff. So the dimension of analysis, and I think this is important here because it's about the versatility of the tool. There are 4 broad dimensions of analysis that we envisage can be used fully or not, depending on the country's preparedness, the stage the country is at, and how much information and time can be dedicated to the analysis. Those 4 dimensions are public policy, planning and development, and it's really critical so that it will support thinking about policy coherence, policy impact, policy costing, and obviously that will lead to governance issues as well. But that's a foundational step for the governance. The budget, and I've decomposed the budget in different sub-dimensions. You can see expenditure programs. You can look at taxes, tax expenditures, and subsidies policies, which are very important if you want to look at both what is positively supporting SBE, what is harmful to SBE. Obviously, one may have a sub-dimension looking at education and awareness because you want to sustain demand for accountability locally in your country, and also specifically analyzing debt sustainability. So that would be obviously your core dimension of analysis for a Blue Public Finance Framework, but all dimensions are important, especially as we build towards better policies and better policy implementation. Dimension 3 is about public procurement and public investment. This is critical if we want to harness the private sector, change its practices, but also look at how the financing flows towards investments which are blue. And the last dimension, which is probably the most tricky one, difficult to deal with, will be sector regulations. Sector regulations obviously have economic impacts, but also have an impact on the public purse. If we think of licenses, if we think of quotas, if we think of regulations which are harmful to your natural resources, that means detrimental, and that will not lead to economic improvements in the future. And it's one of the dimensions we would like to look at. With all of these dimensions, what's important is to keep the adjustment of that framework to the country, and you can vary the sector coverage, you can vary the public sector coverage. So economic sector coverage can be tourism, fisheries, coastal management. You may have a public sector coverage which may be central government that can be extended to the local governments and perhaps the public enterprises later on. This could be fundamental in countries like Vietnam, where you have local governments sitting on a massive amount of public corporations. Frank, if I finish the slide and then take your question, is that okay? Right. Then there are issues when using such a framework to make it useful. It's got to be tied to the transition framework, but it's got to be tied to a governance framework. So one has to decide what will be the governance of running this exercise and how it will be leading to outputs that can be linked to the country budget cycle, which we think is important to give it credibility and to give it weight with parliamentary decision making. And then there are issues a bit more technical about scoring methodologies that will have to be discussed every time the country wants to apply the methodology, either weighting mechanisms, either a scoring methodology. But there are already options on the table, practical ones existing, applied, others that have been tested, as will be discussed by our colleague Himanshu Sharma in a few minutes. Frank, I can take your question before the last slide.
Yes, two questions, one very specific and one which may be more targeted at Dennis. So the specific one is, how do you account for elements that are provided by the government, for instance, but that are underpriced in the first element of budget? Let me give you an example. If, for instance, like you have in China, a lot of public companies get capital from the government at a price which is below market, which is a subsidy. It doesn't appear as a subsidy in the accounts, in the books, if you want, but it is a subsidy. So that's the first question. And then the second question is for Dennis. Do you plan, because we had last year first country endorsing the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Principles, do you plan to use these framework going back to those countries and now saying if any country wants to endorse the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Principle, then you should go through that process or do something in that vein?
And Jerome, do you want to go ahead and then?
Sure, I'll go ahead. So if you go back to the previous slide, really the framework is about public finance. So it doesn't really fully look at economic analysis of lending below market price, but it is possible to extend on the number 3 to the public enterprises. And under that analysis, it's well possible to look at whether the public sector from the government finances those public enterprises and the cost to public purse. So if that is under market price, that can be registered there as a negative flow.
I hope that answered your first question, Frank. I also see that Hima has put tax expenditures in the chat, but Hima, you'll be able to expand on that in a second. To your second question, Frank, so far there is nothing written in stone, but I think what we are working toward and working on the UNEP side is this very much comprehensive package coming from UNEP side on sustainable blue economy, and I think today it is one, maybe not the first, but one attempt to kind of present everything, how it fits together, the different work that's done at UNEP and UNEP-FI on sustainable blue economy and finance. And, you know, as you say, Portugal has endorsed the principles last year as the first government to do so. And if you remember last year, you know, this was purely kind of a, you know, we gave recommendations, but essentially we from the UNEP-FI side didn't have a work stream on what to do with governments. But this is exactly what Ole and his team and Jerome are now doing. And I think going forward, what we're really looking for is to bring the transition framework as well as our principles, the sustainable blue economy finance principles, together two countries as a package. And so you would have the governance and policy and public finance work done by Ole and Jerome, and you would have UNEP-FI's work with, you know, local banks, insurers, investors, and the DFIs on trying to align what is happening at the governmental level in terms of policy and governance development with what is happening on the ground in terms of private and public finance deployment. And ideally, yes, you're right, that should be aligned with the sustainable economy finance principles. They are applicable. So that is kind of the plan forward for us. And this is also one of the reasons why we wanted to present these different pieces of the puzzle today. One more coming up from Hina in a second as well.
Sorry, Dennis, but what would then a country commit to endorsing the principles? In your case, committing to do all the different elements you propose, which are very ambitious, or
yeah, I think that's probably still to be completely defined so far, to be open. There isn't right now a specific requirement, but I would argue that engaging in the transition framework process would be one of the requirements. And then on the financing side, so far what we have communicated is to ensure that, you know, national and that might be private financial institutions do sign the principles, the sustainable blue economy finance principles. So, you know, essentially championing the principles with different countries, you know, but also within the country, you know, across the insurance and banking sectors to be applied. I think these two things are the recommendations that I would think would make sense at this stage. But again, this is not completely finalized at this stage. Also, because of course the piloting of the transition framework is only starting now, so we, you know, it might be a bit ahead of the curve at this stage. All right, I might hand over back to Jerome just in the interest of time, because I know that Hima also has a brief presentation afterwards, but just to allow also some questions for him in a sec. Jerome, back to you.
Thank you, Dennis. I think I cannot see what's written in the chat for some reason. If you go back to previous slide, just very quickly, I think Imanchu, as you mentioned dimension 2B, tax expenditures and subsidies policies. And not all of those are always very transparent and clearly written out. So tax expenditures and subsidies policies, you may often have to recalculate them yourself, and it may be part of the work of the advocacy work of different partners to make those explicit and clear, and their costs well recorded in the budget, so that we understand those tax expenditures and subsidies. Anything like exemptions or, as you mentioned, subsidies to through the interest rate of a capital to a public enterprise, for example. So last slide, please, Dennis. So this Blue Public Finance Framework, how will it help support financing? Well, if we take these guidelines from ADB, we've very freely used that idea. We understand that we may have the governments receiving capital inflows from different investors. And the idea here is to use what is being done with green bonds and apply to blue bonds, for example. And this is why we have dimensions on public procurement and public investment. By using the BPFF, you have a much better credibility in how the government handles its public investments and how the government's policies are being translated into practical terms. So what you're giving to your potential investors is that credibility, so you can be able or be in a position to emit blue bonds as a government to access financing for your blue projects. And those will have obviously ocean benefits for local and global communities. So behind any work being done on the credibility and on the quality of your budget and your budget reporting is enabling better financing of your government activities. That's it for now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jerome. I would like to just hand over to Hima very briefly. I do realize we have like 5 minutes left, so maybe Hima, you can swiftly talk about the sustainable budgeting approach, and then if there's time, we might be able to ask 1 or 2 questions depending on everyone's availability. Over to you.
Perfect. Sounds good. So yeah, I'll just quickly jump into it. Jerome's excellent Blue Public Finance framework provides a whole of PFM, public financial management framing, to the sustainable blue economy issue. Now, the piece that I will introduce is a subset and focuses on budget design and scoring and how to support policymakers with evidence-based tools to both measure and improve the alignment of socioeconomic and environmental sustainability in budgets, and that includes blue economy in the future. So let's start with how we got here. Last year, we launched the Global Recovery Observatory, which is a live database measuring the greenness of COVID-19 fiscal responses covering 89 countries. And we now have over 8,900 individual policies in this database, and each and every one of them has been categorized to a granular level using a novel fiscal taxonomy developed for this exact purpose. And then we assessed each policy for ex-ante potential directional impacts using a 5-point Likert scale on a range of indicators, as you can see in the slide on your screens. But as the pandemic's worst effects, the deaths and the hospitalizations have declined, we want to be able to assess a nation's budget's alignment with their national development strategies and not just the COVID-19 related spending. So why focus on budgets? There is no annual regulatory policy cycle or process that could integrate and mainstream environmental goals into environmental strategy and policy implementation. The government's annual budget cycle is widely recognized as its most important policy statement and its most powerful policy integration and mainstreaming instrument, which directly influences consumption and production patterns and private sector allocation and investment decisions. And when fiscal resources are scarce, there is very little room for error. This is the case in many emerging lower income and one could also say advanced economies right now, where the consequences can be particularly damaging. Now, given the combined effects of COVID-19 and the Ukraine crisis, social care costs are inflated, taxation revenues are dramatically reduced, and pathways to a normalized post-COVID-19 era is uncertain. So with the University of Oxford, we are now building a practical enabling tool for policymakers, you can switch the slide, based on leading socioeconomic and environmental science to understand the development, environmental, and social consequences of budgetary decisions. 2, to assess the overall characteristics of their budgets and increase opportunities for knowledge and experience sharing with other nations who might also undertake this exercise. And in addition, it can also be a powerful tool for increased transparency and accountability for member states, providing useful forward guidance, signaling, and credible monitoring for potential investors and financial institutions. Now, the SBA, the Sustainable Budgeting Approach, has been successfully piloted in Gabon, collaborating with a multi-ministry group, including the Ministry of Water and Forests, the Sea and the Environment, the Ministry of Finance, and others. And this was part of an integrated national financing framework. The application produced a sustainability-oriented public financial management review of Gabon as a baseline to understand its public financial position and its progress towards SDGs and climate objectives before integrating a new green fiscal taxonomy that is, again, custom designed for the country into the Gabonese policymaking process. And this covered the full universe of country-calibrated fiscal policy options so that the public investment options and taxation options are fully mapped out for policymakers to deliberate. We will be shortly launching a global methodology and guidance note for the SBA, and I welcome your feedback and interest in helping us improve the relevance of this exercise for you and for member states. And specifically for the blue economy issues, in addition to the indicators that you saw on the previous slide, we will be exploring the addition of a blue economy impact score to every budget item, for example, or to, for example, subsidies or taxation expenditures, as Jesus had mentioned, which would be giving policymakers a scientifically credible and transparent understanding of the potential impacts of every budget item or a sectoral budget and its items if they don't want to look at the whole budget, and its alignment with their blue economy strategy and targets. And 3 indicators that we're adding in addition to a blue impact score would be direct and indirect adaptation and resilience score, and a job impact score. And the value added from our perspective of this exercise in comparison to what other exercises there exist is that we are looking at the whole range of environmental, social, and economic indicators and not focusing on, for example, just climate change or just biodiversity or just blue economy, but giving policymakers the opportunity to see trade-offs across all of those. As you can see on the slide, it's very indicative, but for example, the first illustration that you see in Gabon, like of a policy and seeing of all of these indicators, which policy is better. And so policymakers can judge, and also investors and financial institutions have this information to then judge, like where is the country's roadmap going? Is their investment going to bear out, et cetera, et cetera. I'll quickly stop here. I know I've been going very fast, but I want to respect your time. So yeah, happy to take questions.
See, Frank has asked a question in the chat around water pollution, if that would also be added.
Yes,
I
it
need
is.
to go,
It is.
sorry. I have
It is
another meeting
measured.
starting.
No worries,
we-
Frank. Thanks for being on the call.
Yeah,
Yes.
we do measure air pollution impact.
Super. I see that Kai is still on, and Eva, if you have any questions, feel free to share now. But I do realize we're at time, but do want to give you the opportunity to share any thoughts or questions you may have before we finalize. Nothing from your side, Kai. Super. Okay, I do realize there's a lot of information in one meeting. What we'll do, as you said earlier, is share the recording as well as the slides with everyone. And as announced already last time, we'll probably have a next call. I'll try to schedule that for after the summer, where we can hopefully give you a bit of an update, especially on the budgeting and work, as well as on the transition framework piloting, how that's going. So more to come after the summer, hopefully also a focus on the blue bond guidance that I mentioned last time, that we're going to seek most likely your input on over the summer, so we can discuss that as well during the next meeting. And with that, I might wrap up. Hope to see many of you in Lisbon, possibly, fingers crossed. And otherwise, if there are any questions on any part of the presentation, feel free to reach out to me, and I can then relay your questions to the relevant colleagues as well. Thanks very much. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, bye.
Have a nice week.
Thank you.